from 0 to 12 million square miles in just 25 years. How do you conquer territory 4 times the size of Alexander's empire in a fraction of the time? The answer lies in Genghis Khan's revolutionary approach to warfare that broke every rule of medieval combat. Today, we're diving deep into the entire history of the Mongol Empire, its brutal tactics, psychological warfare, and strategic genius that built the fastest-growing empire the world has ever seen. But before we get into it, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Your support means we can continue producing these highly researched videos to help you learn something new or pass the time. Thank you for joining me today. Please say hello in the comments. Let us know where you're watching from and what time it is. We're on to building a global community here. So without further ado, let's get started, shall we? Mongol Empire. How Genghis Khan ruthlessly built history's fastest empire. The cradle of the steppe, a world of conflict and horses. The Mongolian plateau stretches vast and unforgiving, a land where winter brings bitter cold and summer delivers drought. Here, grass is currency, water is power. Survival demands movement. This was no place for the weak. For centuries, nomadic tribes drifted across these endless steppes. They herded sheep, cattle, yaks, and horses through seasonal pastures. Their felt tents, called jur, moved with the seasons. Their world was one of livestock and raids, blood oaths, and betrayals. The 12th century brought chaos to the plateau. Powerful confederations rose and fell. The Khanate controlled the central grasslands near the Toul River. The Naiman dominated the west, the Merkit held the north. The Tatars, allied with the Yuan Dynasty to the south, posed threats in the east. Between these powers, smaller tribes like the Mongols fought for scraps. Climate played its role too. Recent studies of lake sediments reveal a dramatic shift. The 1180s brought severe drought to the region. Grass withered, herds thinned. Tribes competed for dwindling resources. When pastures fail, warriors raid. When raids escalate, blood feuds ignite. These were not unified peoples. The steppe tribes shared language and customs, yet they remained fractured. Clan loyalty trumped broader identity. A man's allegiance belonged to his Khan, not to some imagined nation of Mongols. Warfare on the steppe followed ancient patterns. Light cavalry ruled the battlefield. Riders learned to shoot composite bows from horseback before they could walk. Every able male was both herder and warrior. Raiding was not merely violence, it was wealth redistribution. Cattle, women, and captives became property through force. Yet, these raids remained small-scale. Tribal. Personal. The Yuan Dynasty to the south understood this fragmentation. They had long manipulated the nomads, paying tribute to some chiefs while encouraging others to attack their rivals. The Jurkins who ruled the Jin had even taken Mongol leaders captive. They crucified Ambagai Khan, a Mongol chieftain, in the mid-12th century. They nailed him to a wooden donkey and left him to perish. This brutality taught the tribes a lesson. Sedentary empires saw them as expendable barbarians. Among these scattered clans, one family line carried the name Borjigin. They were not kings. They were minor nobility at best. Their leader, Yasuge, had some reputation as a warrior. He had a handful of loyal followers. He had captured his wife, Holun, from the Merkit tribe. He had made alliances through blood oaths. But he was no conqueror. Around 1162, Holun gave birth to a son. Legend claims the boy emerged clutching a blood clot in his fist, a sign, shamans whispered, of a warrior's destiny. They named him Temüjin, after a Tatar warrior Yasuge had defeated in battle. The child would grow up in a world of constant conflict. Intertribal warfare defined existence. Feuds stretched across generations. A wrong committed decades prior could spark fresh violence. Trust was rare. Betrayal was common. The horse made all of this possible. The Mongolian pony was small, hardy, and tireless. It could survive on sparse vegetation. It could travel vast distances. A warrior maintained multiple mounts, rotating them to preserve their strength. These animals weren't mere transportation. They were the foundation of nomadic power. Horse archery required years of training. Boys practiced from childhood, shooting at targets while riding at full gallop. The composite bow, made from layers of wood, horn, and sinew, could pierce armor at considerable distance. Combined with mobility, this created a devastating military advantage. But technology alone didn't win wars. Organization mattered. So did leadership. And in the late 12th century, the Mongolian steppe had no single leader. No unifying vision, just scattered tribes locked in endless, petty conflicts. Climate change in the 1180s intensified these struggles. When drought strangled the grasslands, tribes either submitted to stronger neighbors or fought for survival. Many chose the latter. This was the world into which Temüjin was born. A world where violence was routine, where loyalty could evaporate overnight, where today's ally might become tomorrow's executioner. The stage was set, the actors were in place. All that remained was for one boy, abandoned and betrayed, to reshape the entire system. The boy named Temüjin, blood vows and early trauma. Temüjin was 8 or 9 years old when everything changed. Yasuge had taken his son on a journey to the Ongirat tribe, seeking a bride for the boy. This was custom among the steppe peoples. Arrange marriages early, secure alliances for the future. They found a suitable match, a girl named Borte, daughter of a tribal elder named De Session. The families agreed. Yasuge left his son with the bride's family and began the journey home. On the way, Yasuge encountered Tatars holding a feast. Hospitality was sacred on the steppe. A traveler could expect food and shelter, even from enemies, if he approached without weapons or ill intent. But the Tatars recognized him. Years earlier, Yasuge had raided their camps. He had taken their people captive. Old wounds don't heal easily on the steppe. They poisoned his drink. Yasuge managed to reach home, but the damage was done. By the time Temüjin arrived, his father had already perished. The boy found his mother Holun weeping over the body. The family's world collapsed in that moment. Yasuge's death created a succession crisis. He had left behind 2 wives and 7 children. In normal circumstances, Yasuge's brothers would have taken the family under their protection. But steppe custom also allowed them to refuse. Supporting a dead man's family meant sharing scarce resources. They refused. Worse still, the Taichiut clan, which had followed Yasuge, decided to abandon the family, and the new Taichiut leader saw no benefit in supporting a widow and her children. One day, as the tribe prepared to move camp, Holun grabbed Yasuge's spirit banner and confronted them. She shamed them. She invoked her husband's memory. They waited until nightfall, then left anyway. Temujin's family was cast out. They were left to survive on their own in the harsh steppe wilderness. Holun proved resourceful. She taught her children to fish, to dig for wild roots, to hunt small game. They survived on scraps. They ate rats and field mice when necessary. This was no life for a chieftain's family. This was the existence of outcasts. Temüjin had an older half-brother named Beter from Yasuge's second wife. As the eldest male, Beter could claim leadership of the family under Levirate custom. This created tension. Food was scarce. Every meal sparked disputes. One day, Temüjin and his full brother Kasar were hunting. They shot a bird. Beter took it for himself. Later, they caught a fish. Again, Beter claimed it. Temüjin and Kasar made a decision. They tracked Beter to a hillside where he sat alone. They shot him with arrows. They left him to perish. When Holun learned what her sons had done, she was furious. She rebuked them bitterly. Beter's younger brother Belgute, however, did not seek revenge. He joined Temujin's camp instead. This choice would prove significant. Belgute became one of Temujin's most trusted followers. The Taichiut heard rumors that Yasuge's son had survived and was growing strong. They saw a potential threat. One day, they raided Temujin's camp. The boy fled, but they tracked him down and captured him. They placed a wooden collar called a kang around his neck, a heavy yoke that prevented escape. Temüjin endured this captivity for months. Then, during a feast when his captors grew drunk, he struck his guard with the kange and fled into the darkness. He hid in a river, submerging himself except for his face. A sympathetic man from the camp found him and chose not to sound the alarm. Later, this man's sons would join Temujin's army. The escape became legend among his early followers. It demonstrated resourcefulness. It showed will to survive. Years passed. Temüjin reached adulthood. He decided to claim his promised bride. He traveled to the Ongirat and found Borte waiting. Her family honored the betrothal. They gifted the couple a luxurious black sable coat. Temüjin understood that this coat represented more than a wedding gift. Sable was valuable. It could buy alliances. He took the coat to Togrul, Khan of the Karaite tribe. Togrul had been Yasuge's blood brother, his Onda. When Yasuge had been alive and powerful, he had helped Togrul secure his throne. Now, Temüjin arrived offering the coat as tribute, hoping to invoke that old bond. Togrul accepted. He declared himself Temujin's adoptive father. Suddenly, the young outcast had a powerful patron, but the steppe does not forgive easily. The Merkit tribe remembered that Yasuge had stolen Hoylun from one of their men decades earlier. They wanted revenge. Early one morning, 300 Merkit warriors descended on Temujin's small camp. Someone shouted a warning. Temujin fled on horseback. His family scattered. In the chaos, Borte was left behind. The Merkit took her captive. Temujin rode to Burkhan Khaldun, a sacred mountain. He climbed to a high place and made a vow. He pledged that if the mountain protected him, he would honor it for all his days. This ritual became part of his personal mythology, the idea that heaven itself favored his survival. Then he acted. He went to Togrul and requested military aid to rescue his wife. Togrul agreed to help. He also suggested that Temujin contact an old childhood friend, Jamuka. Jamuka was a rising leader among the tribes. He had charisma. He had warriors. He also had history with Temujin. They had exchanged gifts as boys and sworn to be blood brothers. Jamuka agreed to join the rescue. With combined forces, they attacked the Merkit camp at dawn. The raid succeeded. Borte was found among the fleeing refugees and reunited with Temujin, but she had been captive for 8 months. Shortly after her rescue, she gave birth to a son. The boy was named Jochi, meaning guest. Doubt would always surround Joki's paternity. Some whispered that the Merkit had fathered him. Temujin claimed the boy as his own, but the shadow never fully lifted. After the rescue, Temujin and Jamuka spent time together. They camped side by side. They hunted together. They renewed their childhood friendship. But friendship on the steppe is fragile. After about 18 months, Jamuka suggested they move camp. Temujin's wife Borte warned him that Jamuka grew bored easily with companions. Something about the suggestion felt wrong. Temujin made a choice. He separated from Jamuka. He took his followers and moved away. Soon after, other warriors began drifting to Temujin's camp. They came because they sensed opportunity. They came because Temujin rewarded loyalty and merit rather than noble birth. In 1186, a group of tribal elders proclaimed Temujin Khan of his own tribe. This was both an honor and a challenge. It placed him in direct competition with Jamuka. The former blood brothers were now rivals, and on the Mongolian steppe, rivalry often ends in bloodshed. The unifier, forging alliances and breaking rivals. Temujin's path to supremacy was not a straight line. It was a maze of shifting alliances, tactical retreats, and brutal reversals. His early years as Khan were precarious. He commanded loyalty from a few hundred warriors, perhaps 1,000 at most. Against him stood established powers, Jamuka with thousands of followers, Togrul of the Karaite, his supposed patron, and the Tatars, who had resources and Jin dynasty support. Temujin's strategy relied on careful alliance building and ruthless opportunism. In the mid-1190s, he allied with Togrul to attack the Tatars. The Jin dynasty, tired of Tatar raids, supported this campaign. Temujin and Togrul defeated the Tatars in a series of engagements. For his service, the Jin court gave Temujin a minor title. More importantly, he gained reputation and plunder. But Temujin did something unusual after defeating the Tatars. Traditional steppe warfare involved taking captives and integrating them into the victor's tribe. Temujin ordered the systematic elimination of all Tatar males taller than a cart axle. This was not mere revenge for his father's poisoning. It was a calculated message. Resistance would be met with extermination, not assimilation. Survivors were distributed among Mongol families. Even Yasuge's widow, Hoylun, adopted Tatar orphans. One of these boys, Shigi Kutuk, would later become one of Temujin's most trusted officials. Meanwhile, Jamuka was building his own coalition. In 1201, a Kurultai, a gathering of tribal leaders, proclaimed him Gur Khan, universal ruler. This was a direct challenge to Temujin. 13 tribes joined Jamuka's confederation. The two forces met at the Battle of the 13 Sides. Details are scarce, but the outcome was clear. Jamuka won. Temujin's army was scattered. He retreated into the wilderness with a handful of loyal followers. This was perhaps the lowest point of his life. He had lost a major battle. Many of his allies abandoned him. Some sources suggest he may have even been captured briefly or submitted to the Jin dynasty for a time. But he did not break. Over the following years, Temujin slowly rebuilt. He made a critical innovation. He began promoting men based on ability rather than birth. In traditional steppe society, leadership passed through bloodlines. Temujin ignored this. He elevated commoners who showed skill and loyalty. He created a personal guard, the keshik, drawn from the families of his generals. These guards served as both bodyguards and a school for future commanders. Togrul remained his patron, but the relationship grew strained. Togrul's son, Sengum, resented Temujin's rising power. He convinced his father that Temujin posed a threat. In 1203, Togrul invited Temujin to a feast. It was an ambush. Temujin learned of the trap at the last moment and fled. A battle followed. Temujin's forces were outnumbered. He retreated to a remote region near Lake Baljuna with only a few dozen loyalists. This moment became mythic. At Lake Baljuna, Temujin and his companions swore oaths of eternal loyalty. They drank from the muddy water and pledged to share both victory and defeat. Those who stood by him at Baljuna would later hold the highest positions in the empire. From this desperate position, Temujin struck back. He gathered reinforcements and launched a surprise attack on Togrul's camp. The Karaite were caught unprepared. Their forces scattered. Togrul fled and was eventually ended by border guards who did not recognize him. With the Karaite defeated, Temujin absorbed their people into his growing confederation. He took their wealth, their herds, and their warriors. Only one major rival remained, Jamuka. By 1204, Jamuka had allied with the Naiman, the last powerful tribe opposing Temujin. They met in battle. Temujin's forces were disciplined and coordinated. The Naiman and their allies broke under the assault. Jamuka fled. He spent months on the run, but eventually his own men betrayed him. They handed him over to Temujin in chains. The two former friends met for the final time. According to the chronicles, Jamuka acknowledged Temujin's superiority. He requested an honorable end, one without bloodshed, as befitted a nobleman. Temujin granted the request. Jamuka was executed by having his back broken, a method that spilled no blood. Some accounts suggest Temujin mourned his former Anda. Others say he simply disposed of a rival. Either way, Jamuka's demise removed the last significant obstacle to Mongol unity. By 1206, Temujin controlled all the major tribes of the Mongolian plateau. He had defeated the Tatars, the Karaite, the Naiman, the Merkit, and countless smaller clans. He had survived assassination attempts, military defeats, and years of poverty. Now, he stood unopposed. In the spring of 1206, the tribes gathered along the Onon River for a great Kurultai. Thousands of warriors assembled. The most powerful chieftains came to pay homage, shamans performed rituals, a white banner of yak tails was raised, and the assembly proclaimed Temujin as Genghis Khan, universal ruler. The meaning of Genghis remains debated by scholars, some translate it as oceanic or universal. Others suggest fierce or strong. What mattered was not the etymology, but the claim it represented. One man now ruled all Mongols. Genghis Khan stood before the assembly and announced a new order. The old tribal divisions were abolished. Every Mongol now belonged to the nation, not to a clan. Loyalty to the Khan superseded all other bonds. This was not merely political theater. It was a social revolution. The Great Kurultai of 1206, birth of Genghis Khan and the Mongol nation. The Kurultai of 1206 was more than a coronation. It was the formal creation of a new political entity, the Mongol nation. Genghis Khan wasted no time implementing reforms. He understood that conquering the tribes was only the first step. Holding them together required structure, law, and shared purpose. His first major reform restructured the military. He abolished the old tribal units and replaced them with a decimal system. Warriors were organized into units of 10, called arbans. 10 arbans formed a 100-man unit, a jagun. 10 jagans formed a 1,000-man unit, a mingan. And 10 mingans formed a tumen, a 10,000-man division. This system had several advantages. It broke down tribal identities. A warrior's loyalty was now to his unit, not his clan. It also created clear chains of command. Orders flowed efficiently from the Khan to the lowest soldier. Commanders were chosen based on merit. Genghis promoted men who demonstrated skill in battle and loyalty to him personally. Birth mattered less than ability. This principle extended throughout Mongol society. Even slaves who proved their worth could rise to positions of power. The Keshik, the Khan's personal guard, exemplified this meritocracy. Genghis expanded it to 10,000 men. The guard was divided into night watch and day guard. Members were drawn from the families of the generals, ensuring that the elite had personal stakes in the Khan's survival. But the Keshik also functioned as an administrative school. Young men who served in the guard learned governance, law, and military strategy. When they later commanded armies or governed territories, they had been trained in the Khan's methods. Genghis Khan also promulgated a legal code, the Yassa. The Yassa was never written down in a single document during Genghis Khan's lifetime. It existed as a collection of oral decrees memorized by judges and officials. This gave it flexibility. The Khan could modify it as circumstances demanded. It also kept the full content secret, known only to the Mongol elite. The Yassa covered both military and civilian matters. It mandated universal military service, every able male trained in archery, horsemanship, and combat. Refusal to serve was punishable by death. It regulated social behavior. Theft was forbidden, adultery was forbidden, lying was forbidden. The punishments were severe. Many infractions carried the death penalty. Genghis believed that harsh laws maintained order. The Yassa also prohibited blood feuds. Under the old system, a wrong against one clan could spark generations of revenge cycles. Genghis ended this. Disputes were now resolved through his courts. Vengeance was monopolized by the state. Religious tolerance was enshrined in the Yassa. Genghis Khan himself practiced shamanism, but he understood that his future empire would include many faiths. The Yassa declared that all religions were to be respected. Religious leaders were exempt from taxation and military service. This pragmatism served strategic purposes. It reduced resistance in conquered territories and attracted skilled administrators from diverse backgrounds. The Yassa's property laws were strict. Horse theft, given the animal's importance to nomadic life, was a capital offense. Lost property was to be reported and returned. A massive lost and found system operated across the empire, and those who stole lost goods faced execution. One particularly harsh provision of the Yassa addressed military discipline. If one soldier in a unit of 10 fled from battle, the entire unit could be executed. If a unit of 10 fled, the entire 100-man unit could be eliminated. This created intense peer pressure. Warriors policed each other. Cowardice endangered not just yourself, but your brothers. Genghis Khan also established a census. He appointed officials to count every person in the Mongol territories. This data allowed efficient tax collection and troop mobilization. It also helped track populations and ensure no one evaded military service. He created a postal relay system, which would later be called the Yam. Stations were established at regular intervals across the empire. Messengers could travel between stations, switching to fresh horses at each stop. This allowed rapid communication across vast distances. A message could travel from the frontier to the Khan in days rather than weeks. Genghis appointed judges to oversee the Yassa. One of these was Shigi Katuk, the adopted Tatar orphan. Shigi was literate, having learned to write from captured Uyghur scribes. Genghis tasked him with recording legal decisions and creating a judicial registry. This marked the beginning of Mongol bureaucracy. The Khan also distributed positions among his family and followers. His 4 sons by Borte, Jochi, Chagatai, Ogede, and Tolui, were given territories and tumans to command. His brothers and loyal generals received similar grants. But Genghis made clear that these positions were contingent on obedience. He did not tolerate dissent, even from family. One figure who challenged Genghis Khan's authority was a powerful shaman named Teb Tengeri. This shaman had helped proclaim Genghis Khan in 1206, and he wielded considerable spiritual influence. But he grew arrogant. He began interfering in political matters and even threatened Genghis Khan's brothers. Genghis permitted one of his brothers to confront Teb Tengeri. A scuffle followed, and the shaman's back was broken. His body was left outside. When his father came to protest, Genghis claimed the shaman's death was divine judgment. This incident sent a message. No one, not even a powerful religious figure, stood above the Khan. With reforms in place, Genghis Khan turned his attention outward. The Mongolian plateau was unified, but unification alone did not satisfy the warriors. They expected rewards, plunder, land, glory. The Khan needed an enemy. To the south lay rich sedentary civilizations, the Xia, the Jin Dynasty, and beyond them, the Song Dynasty. These were cultures with cities, agriculture, and wealth. They were also the same empires that had long manipulated and exploited the steppe tribes. Genghis Khan decided to strike at the Xia first. It was the weakest of the three. It also controlled trade routes linking the steppe to the Silk Road. Conquering it would provide resources and experience in siege warfare, something the Mongols lacked. In 1207, Genghis launched a series of raids into Xia territory. These were probing attacks, testing defenses, and gathering intelligence. The raids were successful. The Tangut people of Xia proved unable to stop the Mongol cavalry on open ground. But the Mongols struggled against walled cities. They had no experience with sieges. They lacked engineers and siege equipment. Early attempts to take Tangut fortresses failed. Genghis learned from these failures. He began recruiting specialists. When the Mongols captured cities, they spared engineers, craftsmen, and literate administrators. These people were integrated into the Mongol military machine. By 1209, Genghis was ready for a full-scale invasion. The war machine. Anatomy of the Mongol military. The Mongol army was the most effective fighting force of the 13th century. Its success was not accidental. It resulted from superior organization, training, discipline, and adaptability. The foundation of Mongol military power was the horse. Every Mongol warrior maintained 4 or 5 mounts. This allowed constant rotation, keeping the horses fresh. A Mongol army could travel up to 100 kilometers per day, far faster than infantry-based armies. The horses themselves were remarkable. Mongolian ponies were small but incredibly hardy. They could survive on sparse grass. They could endure harsh weather. They required minimal care compared to the larger war horses used in Europe and China. The Mongol warrior was trained from childhood. Boys learned to ride before they could walk. By age 5, they were practicing archery. Hunts served as military training. The tactics used to encircle and drive game were identical to battlefield maneuvers. The weapon that defined Mongol warfare was the composite bow. Made from layers of wood, horn, and sinew, this bow was powerful and accurate. A skilled archer could hit targets at over 300 meters. The bow could pierce armor at closer ranges. Each warrior carried 2 bows, one for long-range shooting and a heavier one for close combat. They also carried 60 arrows in quivers. Some arrows had light tips for long-distance shots. Others had heavy, armor-piercing heads. Some had whistling heads used for signaling. In addition to the bow, Mongol warriors carried sabers, lances, and sometimes axes or maces, but the bow remained primary. Even heavy cavalry used bows before closing for melee combat. Mongol armor varied by role. Light cavalry wore leather armor or padded cloth. Heavy cavalry wore lamellar armor made from small iron or leather plates laced together. This provided protection while maintaining mobility. Tactics were sophisticated. The Mongols rarely fought in dense formations. Instead, they used fluid, mobile tactics. A typical engagement began with light cavalry harassing the enemy with arrows. They would ride in, shoot, and retreat before the enemy could respond. This created confusion and casualties. If the enemy held their position, the Mongols would employ a feigned retreat. A unit would pretend to flee, drawing the enemy into pursuit. As the enemy became strung out and disorganized, fresh Mongol units would strike from the flanks or rear. This tactic devastated armies that lacked discipline. The Mongols also used deep reconnaissance. Scouts, called mangadai, operated far ahead of the main army. They gathered intelligence on enemy strength, terrain, and defenses. This information was relayed back, allowing commanders to plan campaigns in detail. Coordination was key. Mongol armies often operated in multiple columns, separated by hundreds of kilometers. They would converge on a target simultaneously, overwhelming defenses. This required precise timing and communication, which the Mongols achieved through their disciplined system. The decimal organization allowed flexible deployment. A tumen of 10,000 could operate independently or combine with others for larger campaigns. Units could split and recombine as needed. This adaptability gave the Mongols a huge advantage over more rigid armies. Communication on the battlefield relied on flags, drums, and whistling arrows. Orders could be transmitted quickly across vast distances. This allowed rapid adjustments to tactics during combat. The Mongols also mastered logistics. Each warrior was responsible for his own supplies. They carried dried meat, fermented mare's milk, and other portable food. This reduced the need for supply trains. When necessary, they could live off the land, hunting and foraging as they moved. Intelligence and psychological warfare were integral to Mongol strategy. Before attacking a city, they would send spies to assess defenses and sow fear. Merchants, travelers, and deserters were all sources of information. The Mongols cultivated networks of informants wherever they went. Terror was used deliberately. The Mongols understood that fear could win battles without fighting. When a city resisted and was eventually taken, the population would be slaughtered as an example. Neighboring cities, hearing of this, would often surrender without resistance. Cities that submitted were usually spared. The inhabitants paid tribute and provided supplies, but their lives continued relatively normally. This created a powerful incentive to surrender quickly. The Mongols were ruthless but not irrational. They wanted wealth and resources, not pointless destruction. Terror served strategic purposes. It accelerated conquest and reduced casualties among Mongol troops. Siege warfare was initially a weakness. The Mongols were steppe nomads, not city dwellers, but they adapted quickly. As they conquered northern China, they captured engineers and learned siege techniques. Chinese engineers taught the Mongols to build trebuchets, battering rams, and siege towers. They introduced gunpowder weapons, including primitive bombs and fire arrows. By the time the Mongols invaded Central Asia, they had sophisticated siege capabilities. During sieges, the Mongols would often divert rivers to flood cities or cut off water supplies. They would force captured soldiers to fill moats or act as human shields during assaults. This ruthlessness horrified their enemies, but proved effective. Discipline was ironclad. The Yassa mandated severe punishments for cowardice or disobedience. Warriors who fled from battle endangered their entire unit. This created intense cohesion. Mongol soldiers fought for each other as much as for the Khan. Training exercises mimicked actual combat. Large-scale hunts, called nurg, were conducted annually. These hunts involved thousands of warriors encircling vast territories and driving game into a killing zone. The tactics used were identical to battlefield encirclements. The Mongols also incorporated foreign troops into their armies. Conquered peoples were organized into auxiliary units. Turks, Chinese, Persians, and others fought under Mongol command. This expanded the army's size and brought diverse skills. However, these auxiliaries were not always trusted. They were often placed at the front during assaults, absorbing casualties. Their families were held as hostages to ensure loyalty. The Mongol military was not just an army. It was a total system. Every aspect of society was oriented toward warfare. Boys trained as warriors. Women managed herds and camps, freeing men for campaigns. Elders advised on strategy and diplomacy. This total mobilization gave the Mongols an overwhelming advantage. While other empires struggled to field armies of tens of thousands, the Mongols could mobilize over 100,000 warriors and sustain them for years. By the early 13th century, the Mongol war machine was ready to test itself against the great civilizations to the south. The first conquest, the Xixia kingdom. Bows. The Tangut kingdom of Xixia controlled a prosperous region in what is now northwestern China. It sat astride the Silk Road, collecting taxes from trade caravans. Its capital, Yinchuan, was well fortified. Its army, while smaller than the Jin dynasties, was disciplined and experienced. Genghis Khan had multiple reasons to target Xixia. It was wealthy, it was vulnerable, and it had sheltered enemies of the Mongols, specifically Sengum, the son of the defeated Khanate leader Togrul. In 1205, Genghis launched initial raids into Xixia territory. These were not full invasions, but rather tests. The Mongol cavalry swept through border regions, looting and withdrawing before the Tangut army could respond. The raids revealed Xixia's weakness. It could not defend its vast territory against mobile raiders. The Tangut army was strong in set-piece battles, but ineffective against hit-and-run tactics. In 1209, Genghis decided to invade in force. He assembled an army estimated at 100,000 warriors and crossed the desert into Tangut lands. The Mongols advanced rapidly, bypassing smaller fortresses and striking at key cities. The Tangut army attempted to meet them in open battle. The result was predictable. The Mongol cavalry encircled the Tangut forces and destroyed them with archery. The survivors fled back to the safety of walled cities. But now the Mongols faced a challenge: siege warfare. They had little experience taking fortified positions. Early attempts to storm Tangut cities failed. The defenders held the walls and inflicted heavy casualties on Mongol assault troops. Genghis adapted. He conscripted laborers from captured villages and forced them to build siege equipment. His engineers began constructing crude trebuchets and battering rams. But these weapons were not enough to breach Yinchuan's formidable defenses. The siege of Yinchuan lasted nearly a year. The city was garrisoned by over 100,000 troops, twice the size of the Mongol army. Its walls were high and thick. Its defenders were determined. Genghis attempted an ambitious stratagem. He ordered his engineers to divert the Yellow River toward the city, hoping to flood it. Workers dug channels and constructed dams. For a brief moment, water began flowing toward Yinchuan, and the defenders panicked, but the plan backfired. The dike broke prematurely, and the flood surged back toward the Mongol camp. Hundreds of warriors drowned. Supplies were washed away. The Mongols were forced to retreat to higher ground. Despite this setback, the siege continued. The city's agricultural lands had already been devastated by months of Mongol raids. Crops were destroyed. Supply lines were cut. By early 1210, the situation inside Yinchuan had become desperate. Food supplies dwindled. No relief force arrived from the Jin dynasty. The Jin emperor reportedly said, "It is to our advantage when our enemies attack one another." Emperor Shangzong of Xixia faced a choice: continue resistance and watch his kingdom starve, or submit to the Mongols. He chose submission. In January 1210, Xixia agreed to become a vassal state. The emperor gave his daughter Chaka in marriage to Genghis Khan. He paid tribute of camels, falcons, textiles, and precious metals. He also provided 1,000 young men and women as servants. More importantly, Xixia provided something the Mongols desperately needed: siege engineers. These Tangut specialists understood how to build and operate advanced siege equipment. They knew techniques for undermining walls, constructing towers, and coordinating assaults. Genghis Khan spared the kingdom, but made clear that future betrayals would be met with annihilation. For nearly a decade, Xixia served the Mongols faithfully, providing troops for campaigns against the Jin dynasty. The conquest of Xixia taught the Mongols valuable lessons. They learned that nomadic cavalry, while devastating in open terrain, struggled against fortifications. They learned that acquiring specialists, engineers, administrators, craftsmen, was as important as battlefield victories. They also learned that terror had limits. A population driven to desperation would fight to the end. But a population offered terms could be made useful. The Xixia campaign transformed the Mongol military. They entered as steppe raiders. They emerged with the beginnings of a siege capability that would later crack the greatest cities of Eurasia. With Xixia subdued, Genghis Khan turned his attention to a far more formidable target: the Jin dynasty. The Jin dynasty shattered war with the Golden Kings. The Jin dynasty ruled northern China with an iron fist. The Jurchens who controlled it had conquered the region from the Khitan Liao dynasty in the early 12th century. They commanded millions of subjects, vast agricultural wealth, and a professional army. The Jin had long viewed the Mongols as barbarians to be manipulated. They had paid tribute to some tribes while encouraging others to raid their rivals. They had captured and executed Mongol leaders, including Ambagai Khan, who was crucified decades earlier. Genghis Khan did not forget these humiliations. In 1210, the Jin emperor sent an envoy demanding that Genghis Khan pay homage. Genghis responded with insult. He is reported to have said that the emperor was weak and unworthy, fit only to kneel before heaven. The envoy returned with this message. The Jin emperor executed the Mongol ambassador. This was the provocation Genghis needed. In early 1211, he summoned a Kurultai along the Kurlan River. He climbed a sacred mountain, removed his hat and belt, and prayed to the eternal blue sky. He recounted the generations of suffering the Mongols had endured under Jin manipulation. He detailed the torture and execution of his ancestors. After 4 days, he emerged with a verdict: the eternal blue sky has promised us victory and vengeance. The Mongol army mobilized. Over 100,000 warriors prepared for war. This represented nearly the entire adult male population of Mongolia capable of bearing arms. Only a token force remained to guard the homeland. The Jin dynasty prepared its defenses. The Great Wall, or rather, the Jin-era fortifications that preceded the famous Ming Walls, stretched across the northern frontier. Behind it stood an army estimated 800,000 infantry and 150,000 cavalry. The Jin general Wanyan Chengyu dispersed his forces along the wall, attempting to block all possible crossing points. This proved to be a fatal error. By spreading his troops thin, he left every section weak. Genghis Khan sent scouts to map the defenses. They identified the weakest point, Wusha Fortress, leading to a mountain pass called Yehuling, the Wild Fox Ridge. In March 1211, the Mongol army struck. They broke through at Wusha and poured into Jin territory. The defenders were overwhelmed before reinforcements could arrive. The Jin chancellor led a larger force to block the Mongols at Yehuling, also known as Wild Fox Ridge or the Badgermouth Pass. His army numbered in the hundreds of thousands. But the Jin commander made a critical mistake. Instead of immediately attacking, he sent a messenger to negotiate. The messenger was a Khitan named Shimo Mingan from a people conquered by the Jurchens. He promptly defected and told the Mongols exactly where the Jin army was positioned. The Battle of Yehuling unfolded over several months in 1211. The Mongols used the terrain to their advantage. They divided their forces and struck from multiple directions. The Jin army, despite its numerical superiority, could not coordinate effectively. The Mongols encircled sections of the Jin force and destroyed them piecemeal. Thousands of Jin soldiers were slaughtered. Those who fled were pursued and cut down. The Jin general Wanyan Chengyu barely escaped with his life. After Yehuling, the road to the Jin capital of Zhongdu lay open. Genghis Khan's armies swept through northern China. His general Jebe captured cities in Manchuria. Other forces ravaged the provinces of Hebei and Shaanxi. The Mongols did not yet have the strength to take every fortified city, but they systematically destroyed the countryside. Fields were burned, irrigation systems were wrecked, livestock was taken or slaughtered. The Jin dynasty's economic base collapsed under the assault. By 1213, the Mongols reached Zhongdu, modern-day Beijing. The city was enormous, defended by 40-kilometer-long walls and garrisoned by hundreds of thousands of troops. 3 lines of moats surrounded the fortifications. 900 towers studded the walls. This was not a target the Mongols could take quickly. Genghis Khan attempted to negotiate. He offered to withdraw in exchange for tribute. The Jin court, in chaos after a palace coup that saw the emperor assassinated, agreed. They offered vast quantities of silk, silver, gold, and horses. They gave Princess Chigo, daughter of the former emperor, in marriage to Genghis Khan. The Mongols withdrew. But the Jin emperor Xuanzong made a catastrophic decision. He abandoned Zhongdu and moved the capital south to Kaifeng. He claimed this was a strategic relocation, but the Mongols interpreted it as betrayal. Genghis Khan ordered his armies to return. This time, there would be no mercy. The siege of Zhongdu began in earnest in 1214. The Mongols encircled the city and cut off all supply routes. They did not immediately assault the walls. Instead, they waited. Starvation would do the work for them. Inside the city, conditions deteriorated rapidly. The population, swollen by refugees, exceeded 1 million. Food supplies dwindled. Disease spread. Desperate citizens began eating rats, then leather, then tree bark. By 1215, cannibalism was reported in the streets. The Jin general left in charge of Zhongdu's defense tried to maintain order, but his authority crumbled. Troops deserted. Officials fled. In June 1215, the remaining commanders opened the gates and surrendered. The Mongols entered and sacked the city. The slaughter was immense. Mongol warriors looted every building. Fires raged for weeks. Later visitors described piles of human bones and ashes stretching as far as the eye could see. The fall of Zhongdu marked a turning point. The Jin dynasty had lost its northern capital and half its territory. The emperor, isolated in Kaifeng, ruled over a diminished realm. But Genghis Khan did not press further south. In 1219, events in Central Asia demanded his attention. He left a trusted general, Mukhali, in command of the Chinese front with instructions to continue the war. The Jin dynasty would survive for another 2 decades, but it was effectively finished as a great power. The Mongols had demonstrated that no wall, no matter how formidable, could stop them. More importantly, the conquest of northern China provided the Mongols with millions of subjects, vast resources, and thousands of skilled craftsmen and engineers. The empire was no longer a confederation of nomads. It was becoming a true world power. But Genghis Khan's greatest test still lay ahead. The Westward Turn, the Khwarezmian Catastrophe. By 1218, the Mongol Empire stretched from Manchuria to Central Asia. Genghis Khan had conquered the Xia, shattered the Jin dynasty, and absorbed numerous smaller kingdoms. His reputation spread across Eurasia. To the west lay the Khwarezmian Empire, ruled by Shah Ala ad-Din Muhammad II. This was a vast Islamic state, stretching from the Amu Darya River to the Persian highlands. It controlled critical trade routes linking east and west. Its cities, Bukhara, Samarkand, Urgench, were centers of culture and commerce. Genghis Khan initially sought peaceful relations. Trade benefited the Mongols. They produced little themselves and relied on exchange with sedentary civilizations for goods like textiles, metalwork, and grain. In 1218, Genghis sent a large trade caravan to Khwarezm. The caravan consisted of approximately 450 merchants, many of them Muslims from Central Asia. They carried luxury goods, gold, silver, sable furs, silk, and jade. The caravan also included a formal ambassador bearing letters from Genghis Khan proposing friendship and trade. The caravan arrived at Otrar, a border city on the Sir Darya River. The governor of Otrar was a man named Inalchuk, an uncle of Shah Muhammad and a powerful figure in his own right. Inalchuk accused the merchants of being Mongol spies. Whether this accusation was true is debated. The Mongols did use merchants to gather intelligence, as did most states of the era. But even if some merchants were spies, the traditional response was to expel them or detain them, not execute them. Inalchuk seized the caravan's goods and ordered the merchants executed. Only one man, a camel driver, escaped and brought news back to Genghis Khan. Genghis was enraged, but he did not immediately declare war. He sent a delegation of 3 ambassadors, 1 Muslim and 2 Mongols, to Shah Muhammad. The message was clear: punish Inalchuk and provide compensation, or face the consequences. Shah Muhammad, likely influenced by his mother Turkin Khatun and pressured by court factions, made a catastrophic choice. He had the Muslim ambassador beheaded. The 2 Mongol ambassadors had their beards shaved, a grave insult in Mongol culture, and were sent back. This was beyond insult. In Mongol law, ambassadors were sacred. To harm them demanded vengeance. Genghis Khan suspended his war against the Jin dynasty. He recalled his generals. He assembled the largest Mongol army ever fielded. Estimates range from 100,000 to 200,000 warriors. Every available Tumen was mobilized. In 1219, the Mongol invasion of Khwarezm began. Shah Muhammad commanded a much larger army, perhaps 400,000 men. But his empire had critical weaknesses. It was newly formed, having rapidly expanded through conquest in the preceding decades. Its administration was still developing. Its military was divided among regional governors who often competed for power. More problematically, Shah Muhammad did not trust his own generals. His mother, Turkin Khatun, controlled significant military forces independently. The Turkish troops who formed the empire's core were not always loyal to the Persian bureaucracy. The Shah made a strategic error. Instead of concentrating his army to meet the Mongols in open battle, he dispersed his forces across fortified cities. He believed the Mongols, as nomads, would struggle against urban defenses. He was wrong. Genghis Khan divided his army into multiple columns. One force, led by his sons Chagatai and Ogedei, moved directly toward Otrar. Another, under his eldest son Jochi, advanced north toward Urgench. A third column, commanded by Genghis himself, targeted the heart of the empire, Bukhara and Samarkand. The Mongols also sent 2 of their greatest generals, Jebe and Subutai, on a special mission. They were to pursue Shah Muhammad wherever he fled and prevent him from organizing resistance. The invasion moved with terrifying speed. The Mongols crossed the desert, bypassing expected routes. They appeared before cities whose defenders had no warning. Otrar was besieged in late 1219. The city, well fortified and garrisoned, held out for 5 months. Governor Inalchuk fought stubbornly, but eventually a commander inside the city, resentful of Inalchuk's authority, opened the gates. The Mongols stormed in and slaughtered most of the garrison. Inalchuk retreated to the citadel with the last defenders. He held out for another month, personally throwing tiles and bricks down on the attackers. When he was finally captured, Genghis Khan ordered a symbolic execution. Some accounts claim molten silver was poured into his eyes and ears, representing the greed that had led him to seize the caravan's wealth. This story may be legend, but it reflects the Mongols' use of terror as a weapon. With Otrar fallen, the heartland of Khwarazm lay exposed. The Storm of Terror, the annihilation of Khwarazm. In February 1220, Genghis Khan's army appeared before Bukhara. The city was one of the great centers of Islamic learning, home to libraries, mosques, and scholars. It was also heavily fortified and garrisoned. The Mongols did not immediately assault. Instead, they sent a message: surrender and live, or resist and perish. The Turkish garrison attempted to break out and attack the Mongols. This was exactly what Genghis wanted. The Mongols feigned retreat, drawing the garrison out of the city. Once the soldiers were in open ground, Mongol cavalry encircled them and destroyed them. With the garrison eliminated, Bukhara's remaining defenders had no choice. The city elders opened the gates. Genghis Khan rode into Bukhara and went directly to the Great Mosque. He climbed onto the pulpit, a place reserved for religious leaders, and addressed the assembled population. According to chroniclers, he declared, "I am the punishment of God. If you had not committed great sins, God would not have sent a punishment like me upon you." The Mongols looted the city systematically. They spared scholars and craftsmen, conscripting them into Mongol service. They took whatever was valuable, but they also engaged in calculated destruction. The great library was burned, many buildings were set aflame, tens of thousands of citizens were executed, others were enslaved. The survivors were left with a clear message: submit immediately or face annihilation. From Bukhara, Genghis marched to Samarkand. This city was even larger and more prosperous. It was defended by an estimated garrison of 110,000 soldiers, though this figure likely includes militia and armed citizens. When the Mongols arrived in March 1220, they immediately began siege operations. But they also engaged in psychological warfare. They drove captured prisoners before their assault troops, forcing them to fill in moats and scale walls. This horrified the defenders and reduced Mongol casualties. The siege lasted only a few days. The Turkish garrison, seeing the destruction of Bukhara and fearing similar fate, negotiated a surrender. They were promised safe passage if they laid down arms. When they emerged from the city, the Mongols surrounded them. The entire garrison was systematically eliminated. The civilian population faced a selection. Craftsmen, engineers, and young women were spared and distributed among the Mongol army. Many able-bodied men were conscripted to serve in future sieges. The remainder were executed. Contemporary chroniclers reported that the Mongols ordered each soldier to execute a certain number of citizens. One account claims that 50,000 Mongol warriors were each assigned 24 people to eliminate. These numbers are almost certainly exaggerated. Such a task would have taken days and served no tactical purpose. But the accounts reflect the scale of the terror. The destruction of Samarkand sent shockwaves across the Islamic world. If the greatest cities could fall in days, what hope did smaller towns have? Meanwhile, Shah Muhammad fled westward. Jebbe and Subutai pursued him with 20,000 cavalry. This was not a normal military campaign. It was a hunt. The Shah fled through northern Persia, desperately trying to rally forces, but his authority had collapsed. Governors refused to commit troops. His own soldiers deserted. He reached the Caspian Sea and took refuge on an island. There, in December 1220, Shah Muhammad perished, likely from dysentery and exhaustion. His empire died with him, but Jebbe and Subutai did not return to the main army. They had been given permission by Genghis Khan to continue their reconnaissance. What followed would be one of the most extraordinary military expeditions in history. The final major city to fall was Urgench, the capital of Khwarazm. This city was defended by Turkin Khatun, the Shah's mother, and her loyalists. The siege, led by Joki, lasted from late 1220 into early 1221. Urgench was built on marshy ground near the Amu Darya River. This made siege operations difficult. The Mongols struggled with the terrain. Jochi was reluctant to completely destroy the city, as it had been assigned to him as part of his inheritance. His brothers Chagatai and Ogedei, however, wanted total destruction. Genghis Khan, learning of the disputes, ordered his sons to cooperate and finish the siege. The Mongols diverted the Amu Darya, flooding parts of the city. They launched repeated assaults. Fighting was brutal, conducted street by street, building by building. When Urgench finally fell in April 1221, the Mongols carried out one of their most complete destructions. The entire population was eliminated or enslaved. The irrigation systems were destroyed. The city itself was leveled. Later chroniclers claimed that not even a cat or dog survived. Urgench would never fully recover. The site was eventually abandoned as the river changed course. By 1221, the Khwarezmian Empire had been annihilated. Every major city had fallen. The economic and cultural centers of Central Asia lay in ruins. Millions had perished or been displaced. The Mongol strategy had been deliberate. They targeted not just military forces, but the very infrastructure of civilization. Irrigation canals were destroyed. Agricultural systems collapsed. Trade networks were severed. This was not mindless destruction. It served strategic purposes. It eliminated resistance. It spread terror to future targets. And it demonstrated that defiance of Genghis Khan led not just to defeat, but to obliteration. The Islamic world reeled from the shock. Chroniclers wrote of the Mongols as a divine punishment, a scourge sent to test the faithful. Some saw them as the apocalyptic army of Gog and Magog, heralding the end of the world. But the Mongol expansion was far from over. Jebe and Subutai were still in the field, and they had their eyes set on new lands to the north. The Great Raid, Subutai and Jebe's epic reconnaissance. After Shah Muhammad's demise, Jebe and Subutai found themselves deep in enemy territory with 20,000 cavalry. They had fulfilled their primary mission. The logical move was to return to the main Mongol army. Instead, they requested permission from Genghis Khan to continue westward, conducting reconnaissance and raiding as they went. Genghis granted permission. What followed was a 3-year, 8,000-kilometer expedition, one of the greatest cavalry raids in military history. From the Caspian Sea, the two generals turned north toward the Caucasus. They raided through northern Persia, sacking cities and gathering intelligence. They spent the winter of 1220 to 1221 in the Mughal steppe, resting their horses and consolidating plunder. In early 1221, they invaded Georgia. King George IV of Georgia commanded a powerful army, including thousands of armored knights. The Georgians were confident in their military tradition. The Mongols destroyed them. At the Battle of Bardav, Jebe and Subutai used their classic tactics: feigned retreat, encirclement, and overwhelming archery. The Georgian army was annihilated. King George IV barely escaped. The Mongols did not occupy Georgia. They raided, looted, and moved on. Their goal was not conquest, but information. They were mapping the region, assessing military capabilities, and identifying potential threats or allies. They pushed north into the Caucasus Mountains. Crossing these mountains in winter was extremely difficult. The Mongols had to abandon their siege equipment. They lost hundreds of men to cold and treacherous terrain, but they persevered. North of the Caucasus, they encountered a coalition of steppe peoples: Alans, Circassians, and Cumans. These tribes had assembled an army of 50,000 warriors to block the Mongol advance. Jebe and Subutai employed diplomacy alongside force. They sent envoys to the Cumans, who were a Turkic people related to some Mongol tribes. The envoys offered bribes and promised to share plunder if the Cumans abandoned their allies. The Cumans agreed and withdrew. With the coalition broken, the Mongols attacked the Alans and Circassians and defeated them. Then, after the battle, the Mongols turned on the Cumans and attacked them as well. The Cumans, caught by surprise, were routed. This duplicity was typical of Mongol strategy. They used every tool available: diplomacy, bribery, deception, and violence to achieve their goals. The Cumans who survived fled westward into the territories of the Rus principalities. They sought aid from the Rus princes, warning them that the Mongols would eventually attack them too. The Rus' princes convened to discuss the threat. These were independent rulers: Grand Prince Mstislav of Kiev, Mstislav the Bold of Galicia, and others. They rarely cooperated, but the Cuman warnings convinced them to form a coalition. In spring 1223, a combined Rus-Cuman army, estimated at 80,000 warriors, marched south to confront the Mongols. Jebe and Subutai had perhaps 23,000 troops. They were outnumbered and far from reinforcements. Retreat seemed prudent, but the Mongol generals saw an opportunity. They began a feigned retreat, drawing the Rus forces deeper into the steppe. For 9 days, the Mongols fell back, occasionally turning to skirmish, but never committing to battle. The Rus' army pursued confidently, but the pursuit was disorganized. The faster-moving cavalry raced ahead of the slower infantry. The princes did not appoint a unified commander. Each contingent operated independently. On May 31st, 1223, the Mongols turned to fight along the Khalkha River. The location of this river is now uncertain, but it is believed to be near modern-day Donetsk in Ukraine. The Mongols left a small rear guard to bait the Rus vanguard. Mstislav the Bold, eager for glory, attacked this force and drove it back across the river. This initial success convinced the Russes that victory was near. But it was a trap. As the Rus cavalry forded the river and advanced, the main Mongol force struck from multiple directions. The Cumans, terrified of the Mongols from their previous encounters, broke and fled almost immediately. Their retreat threw the Russes' formations into chaos. The Mongol cavalry encircled the disorganized Rus forces. Arrows rained down from all sides. Attempts to form defensive positions failed. The Russes' heavy cavalry, excellent in set-piece battles, proved ineffective against the mobile Mongol tactics. The slaughter was immense. Tens of thousands of Rus warriors perished. Mstislav the Bold barely escaped with a fraction of his army. Mstislav of Kiev, who had been slower to advance, managed to establish a defensive camp on a hill. His forces circled their wagons and erected stakes. For 3 days, the Mongols assaulted this position but could not break through. Eventually, the Mongols offered terms. They promised safe passage if the Rus would surrender their weapons and leave behind their wealth. Mstislav accepted, trusting in the agreement. The Mongols did not honor it. Once the Rus' forces laid down their arms, the Mongols bound the princes and senior commanders. They were placed on the ground, and wooden boards were laid over them. The Mongol generals then held a victory feast on top of the boards, crushing the captives beneath their weight. This brutal execution served as punishment for earlier Russid actions, specifically the execution of Mongol envoys who had tried to negotiate before the battle. The Battle of the Khalkha River was a devastating defeat for the Rus' principalities. Fewer than 1 in 10 warriors returned home. 12 princes perished. The survivors brought tales of an unstoppable enemy from the east. But the Mongols did not pursue their advantage. Jebe and Subutai had accomplished their mission. They had scouted the region, tested enemy capabilities, and demonstrated Mongol military superiority. Occupation was not their goal. They turned east, continuing their reconnaissance. They raided north along the Volga River, encountering the Volga Bulgars. Here, they met their first significant reverse. The Bulgars, a Turkic people who controlled important trade routes, had prepared ambushes along forest paths. The terrain was unfavorable for Mongol cavalry. In September 1223, at the Battle of Samara Bend, the Bulgars defeated the Mongol force, reportedly inflicting 4,000 casualties. This rare defeat highlighted a Mongol weakness. They struggled in heavily forested terrain where their cavalry mobility was negated. But the setback was minor. Jebe and Subutai withdrew, raided Cuman settlements to the south, and then continued east. They rejoined Genghis Khan and the main army in 1224. Genghis Khan praised their achievement. The reconnaissance had been extraordinarily valuable. Jebe and Subutai had mapped vast territories, identified potential enemies and allies, and gathered intelligence on the military capabilities of peoples stretching from Persia to Eastern Europe. They had also demonstrated that the Mongol army could operate independently across thousands of kilometers, sustaining themselves through foraging and plunder. This would prove critical in future campaigns. Tragically, Jebe did not survive long after the expedition ended. He perished in 1224 or shortly thereafter, either from illness or wounds sustained during the campaign. His death was a significant loss. He had been one of Genghis Khan's most brilliant generals. Subutai, however, would continue to serve the empire for 2 more decades. He would later lead the devastating invasion of Eastern Europe in the 1230s and 1240s, using the intelligence gathered during this great raid. The expedition also had profound geopolitical consequences. The defeat at Khalkha River left the Rus' principalities vulnerable and fearful. When the Mongols returned in force 14 years later, many cities surrendered without resistance, remembering the fate of those who resisted. The Georgian kingdom, shattered by repeated Mongol raids, never fully recovered its former strength. It became a tributary state when the Mongols returned for full-scale conquest. The Cumans, driven westward by Mongol pressure, fled into Hungary and the Balkans. Their arrival destabilized the region and created tensions that would later provide a pretext for Mongol invasion of Hungary. Most importantly, the raid revealed to Genghis Khan that the lands to the west were vulnerable. The great cities of Central Asia had fallen. The Caucasus had been penetrated. The Russ's armies had been destroyed. Europe itself lay open to future conquest. But before the Mongols could turn their full attention westward, they had unfinished business in the east. The Jin dynasty still resisted in northern China, and more pressingly, the Xia had betrayed their vassal agreement. In 1225, Genghis Khan led his army back to Mongolia. He was now in his 60s, an advanced age for a warrior of his time. His health was declining, his energy was not what it once was, but his will remained iron, and he had one final campaign to conduct, a campaign of vengeance against those who had dared to defy him. The Xia would learn the price of betrayal, and Genghis Khan would meet his end, pursuing that vengeance, closing the circle that had begun with his rise from nothing to master of the greatest land empire in human history. The sage and the laws, administration, religion, and the Yassa empires rise on the backs of horses. They endure through something quieter: systems, laws, order. By 1206, Genghis Khan understood this truth better than most conquerors ever would. He'd unified the tribes through force and loyalty, but holding them together demanded more than battlefield victories. It required structure. The Yassa emerged from this necessity. Not a single written document, but an evolving code. Oral tradition preserved its core principles. Scholars later reconstructed its contents from Persian chronicles and traveler accounts. The code served three purposes: absolute obedience to the Khan, unity among nomadic clans, severe punishment for wrongdoing. The laws concerned people, not property, a revolutionary principle. Unless confession occurred, guilt remained unproven. Among non-literate Mongols, a spoken word carried sacred weight. The Yassa banned cattle raiding between tribes. It established military organization through the decimal system, groups of 10, 100, 1,000, 10,000, each with clear chains of command. Provisions covered daily life, marriage regulations, inheritance rules, even mundane matters like washing garments during thunderstorms. The code aimed to eliminate disputes before they fractured the newly unified nation. Some penalties were harsh. Adultery meant execution. Theft invited the same fate. Yet this severity bound people together through shared standards. Genghis recognized that conquest required different skills than governance. He surrounded himself with literate advisors from conquered peoples. The most influential was Yelu Chukai, a Khitan scholar from the former Liao dynasty. When they first met in 1218 near the Sari steppe, Genghis reportedly said he'd taken revenge for the Khitans against their Jin enemies. Yelu's response revealed his character. His father and grandfather had served the Jin honorably. He could not consider them enemies. This frankness impressed the Khan. Genghis nicknamed him Longbeard for his distinctive appearance. More importantly, he placed Yelu in his retinue as an advisor. The scholar's expertise in writing and settled governance systems proved invaluable. He accompanied Genghis on campaigns, including the invasion of the Khwarezmian Empire from 1219 to 1221. But Yelu's true influence emerged under Chagatai Khan after 1229. He became chief administrator, essentially a chancellor. His reforms transformed Mongol rule in northern territories. He established regional tax bureaus, replacing arbitrary looting with systematic revenue collection. He persuaded Chagatai that slaughtering conquered peoples wasted their productive capacity. Better to tax them, Chagatai would mock him sometimes. Are you going to weep for the people again? Yet the Khan listened. Yelu's most famous counsel became legendary. Empires may be conquered on horseback. They cannot be governed on horseback. This wisdom shaped how the Mongols would rule their vast domains. He instituted practical reforms: separation of civil and military authority, standardized taxation, storage of grain at regular intervals along trade routes. Schools opened in former Jin territories to educate young Mongol nobles in Confucian traditions. He recruited thousands of Chinese officials into Mongol service. These administrators would later form the backbone of Yuan Dynasty governance. Religious tolerance became another pillar of Mongol administration. Genghis Khan established this principle early. He believed in Tengri, the eternal sky god. but he recognized practical benefits in allowing conquered peoples their faiths. Buddhist monasteries received tax exemptions, so did Muslim communities. Christian churches found protection under Mongol rule. This pragmatism served multiple purposes. It reduced resistance in newly conquered territories. It allowed the Mongols to draw administrators from diverse backgrounds. Persian Muslims managed finances. Chinese Confucians handled civil bureaucracy. Uyghur Buddhists maintained records. Each group brought specialized knowledge. The Yassa itself reflected this tolerance. Its first principle acknowledged one God, creator of all. Yet it never demanded conversion. Religious scholars across the empire enjoyed protection. Mongol commanders received orders to spare religious buildings during sieges. Violators faced punishment, yet certain taboos remained absolute. Mongol shamanic traditions prohibited specific acts, washing in running water, exposing the dead. These customs spread throughout the empire, enforced alongside local religious laws. The Yassa created a framework flexible enough for diverse populations, yet firm enough to maintain order. Administrative reforms extended to communication systems. The Yam postal network, though expanded later under Ogedei, began taking shape. Way stations appeared along major routes. Messengers carried sealed orders across vast distances. This infrastructure enabled centralized control over territories spanning thousands of miles. Genghis Khan died in 1227, but his administrative legacy endured. The Yassa continued guiding Mongol governance long after his passing. Successive Khans proclaimed it at their coronations, adding their own provisions. The code evolved, adapting to new circumstances while preserving core principles. Yelu Chukai exemplified another key aspect of Mongol success. The empire absorbed talent regardless of origin. Defeated enemies became valued advisors. Conquered peoples filled essential administrative roles. This meritocratic approach, radical for its time, created a government structure more sophisticated than pure military rule could sustain. The tension between nomadic traditions and settled governance would persist. But through the Yassa and advisors like Yelu Chukai, the Mongols found a middle path. They maintained their warrior identity while building institutions capable of administering agricultural societies. They preserved mobility while creating permanent structures. They honored their ancestors while learning from conquered civilizations. This synthesis of steppe culture and administrative sophistication allowed the Mongol Empire to function across diverse landscapes. From the forests of Rus to the deserts of Persia to the rice paddies of northern territories. The Yassa provided consistent principles. Skilled administrators adapted those principles to local conditions. Together, they transformed a confederation of nomadic tribes into a transcontinental empire. The third Khan, Ogedei, and the institutionalization of empire. When Genghis Khan passed in 1227, succession could have shattered everything he built. His sons had quarreled for years. Jochi and Chagatai especially despised each other. Yet Genghis had made his choice clear before death. Ogedei, the third son, would lead. Not the eldest, not the most aggressive, but the one with temperament for consolidation. The Kurultai assembled in 1229. After 2 years of regency under Tolui, the tribal leaders formally elected Ogedei as Great Khan. He inherited an empire stretched across Asia, held together primarily by his father's reputation and military momentum. The real work now began, transforming conquest into lasting governance. Ogedei's first priority was permanence. The Mongols had always been mobile, moving with seasons and campaigns. Genghis himself preferred tent cities that could relocate, but an empire spanning from the Pacific to Eastern Europe needed something more stable, a fixed capital. The choice fell on Karakorum, in the Orkhon Valley of Mongolia. Not a coincidence. This region had hosted the capitals of earlier steppe empires, the Turkic Khaganate, the Uyghurs. Ogedei expanded what had been a minor settlement into the empire's political center. Construction began in earnest during the early 1230s. Karakorum became a symbol of Mongol ambition. Walls enclosed administrative quarters, residential districts, and religious buildings. Buddhist temples stood alongside mosques and Christian churches. The palace complex reflected this cosmopolitan character. Chinese artisans designed gardens. Persian craftsmen created decorative metalwork. Mongol aesthetics blended with techniques from across the conquered world. Yet Ogedei never fully abandoned nomadic traditions. The court still migrated seasonally between Karakoram and summer pastures. This dual existence captured the fundamental challenge: how to rule settled peoples while maintaining steppe identity. The capital provided bureaucratic continuity even when the Khan rode elsewhere. Administrative reforms accelerated under Ogedei's reign. Building on foundations laid by advisors like Yelu Chukai, he formalized governmental structures. The Central Secretariat coordinated civilian affairs. Regional branches replicated this structure across provinces. A census system began taking shape. Population counts enabled systematic taxation rather than arbitrary tribute extraction. The Yam postal network underwent massive expansion. What Genghis had initiated, Ogedei perfected. Post stations appeared every 25 to 45 miles along major routes. Each maintained fresh horses, supplies, and accommodations for messengers. Riders carried special tablets called paisa, granting them authority to requisition resources. The system's efficiency was remarkable. Messages could travel 200 miles in a single day. Urgent communications bore bells that alerted stations to prepare immediately. This infrastructure connected Karakoram to the most distant reaches of the empire. Orders flowed outward. Intelligence flowed inward. Trade caravans followed the same protected routes. By the late 13th century, over 300,000 horses and 10,000 stations served the network. Marco Polo later marveled at its sophistication. He observed that the Mongols could communicate across their domains faster than any other power on Earth. The Yam became the nervous system of a transcontinental empire. Economic policies also advanced. Ogedei encouraged the Ordog trading system. Mongol nobles formed partnerships with merchants, providing capital for commercial ventures. This arrangement generated revenue while expanding trade networks. He experimented with paper currency in northern territories, backed by silver reserves. Tax collection became standardized through regional bureaus. Yet challenges emerged from success. As the empire institutionalized, competing interests developed. Military commanders wanted to maintain their autonomy and right to plunder. Civilian administrators sought stable taxation and predictable governance. Ogedei navigated these tensions through compromise and personal authority. His temperament suited this role. Unlike his father's fierce intensity, Ogedei displayed patience and diplomatic skill. He could drink and feast with Mongol nobles while discussing Confucian principles with Chinese advisors. This flexibility kept disparate factions aligned, at least during his lifetime. Military campaigns continued, but with more delegation. Ogedei recognized his limitations as a field commander. He relied on proven generals like Subutai for operations. The conquest of the Yuan Dynasty, begun under Genghis, reached completion in 1234. The Mongol war machine turned westward toward Europe under Batu Khan and Subutai in 1236. Ogedei initiated invasions of Korea starting in 1231. Though complete subjugation remained elusive, tribute arrangements established Mongol influence on the peninsula. In the 1240s, forces even ventured into Tibet. The empire's reach seemed limitless. The Khan maintained a diverse court of advisors. Chinese Confucians like Yelu Chukai provided administrative expertise. Uyghur scribes managed documentation. Persian Muslims handled financial affairs. This multicultural bureaucracy reflected the empire's geographic scope. Each group contributed specialized knowledge, creating hybrid governance systems. Cultural patronage flourished. Ogedei commissioned translations of texts into Mongolian. He supported artistic projects drawing from multiple traditions. The famous silver fountain at Karakoram, which dispensed various alcoholic beverages, symbolized both opulence and openness to foreign craftsmanship. A French artisan designed it. Religious tolerance continued as imperial policy. Ogedei confirmed tax exemptions for religious institutions. Buddhist monasteries, Muslim mosques, Christian churches all received protection. This pragmatism served political purposes, but also reflected genuine Mongol indifference to sectarian disputes. Results mattered more than doctrine, yet personal excesses took their toll. Ogedei was known for heavy drinking. Historical accounts describe legendary consumption. In December 1241, after a particularly extended bout, he died suddenly at Karakoram. He was approximately 55 years old. Chronic alcoholism likely contributed to organ failure. His death created immediate succession crisis. His widow, Turagen, served as regent while political maneuvering intensified. The institutionalization Ogedei had advanced now faced its first major test. Could the structures survive without his personal authority? The answer proved mixed. Again favored different advisors, sidelining figures like Yelu Chukai. Administrative momentum continued, but factional disputes intensified. Eventually, Guyuk, Ogedei's son, became Khan in 1246. His brief reign ended with his death in 1248, triggering further succession struggles. Yet the systems endured. Karakorum remained the capital through these transitions. The Yam continued operating. Provincial administrations functioned. Tax collection proceeded. The institutions Ogedei had built possessed enough resilience to outlast individual rulers, at least temporarily. His legacy lay in this transformation. Genghis had created an empire through military genius. Ogedei gave it bureaucratic form. He established precedents for centralized administration while preserving enough flexibility for regional autonomy. He built infrastructure that enabled communication and commerce across unprecedented distances. The Mongol Empire under Ogedei became more than a military confederation. It evolved into a functioning state with permanent institutions, systematic governance, and economic integration. This foundation would support the empire's continued expansion and eventual evolution into separate Khanates. The third Khan had institutionalized conquest, making temporary victory into lasting power. The European onslaught, the invasion of the Russ's principalities. In 1235, the Kurultai reached a decision. The Mongol armies would turn west in force. What had been probing raids under Genghis and initial expeditions under Ogedei would now become full conquest. The target, the Russ's principalities and beyond, into the heart of Europe itself. Command fell to Bat Khan, grandson of Genghis through Jokchi's line. But the true architect was Subutai, the greatest of all Mongol generals. Now in his 60s, Subutai had fought in campaigns from Korea to the Caucasus. His strategic vision shaped the entire operation. This would be no simple raid. It would be systematic conquest. The force assembled was massive. Estimates suggest between 130,000 to 150,000 warriors, though exact numbers remain debated among scholars. Multiple princes of the blood accompanied Batu, including Guyuk and Mungke, future great Khans. The army represented the full might of the empire, drawing contingents from across its domains. The Rus lands lay fragmented. No unified defense existed. Kiev, Vladimir, Novgorod, numerous principalities competed for power and influence. This division made them vulnerable. The Mongols had faced this pattern before in northern territories and knew how to exploit it. The campaign began in late 1237. The first target was the Volga Bulgars, a Turkic people controlling vital trade routes. Their territory fell quickly to Mongol assault. By early 1238, the army pushed into Rus lands proper. Ryazan stood first in their path. Ryazan's fate became a template. Mongol envoys arrived demanding submission and tribute. The prince refused. The siege began. Mongol siege equipment, refined through campaigns in territories with fortified cities, made short work of wooden walls. The city fell in December 1237. The destruction was total. Chronicles record that few survived. Winter campaigns gave the Mongols advantage. Frozen rivers became highways for cavalry. What normally protected Russes, settlements, dense forests, and marshlands became navigable under ice. The army moved with terrifying speed. Vladimir Suzdal, the most powerful principality, faced assault next. City after city fell. Vladimir, Suzdal, Moscow, then a minor settlement. The Mongols employed psychological warfare alongside military force. Stories of massacres spread ahead of their armies. Some cities surrendered immediately, receiving relatively lenient treatment. Others resisted and faced annihilation. The pattern was deliberate. At the Battle of the Sit River in March 1238, Mongol forces destroyed the army of Grand Prince Yuri II of Vladimir. The prince perished along with most of his warriors. Vladimir Suzdal's military power ceased to exist. The Mongols had eliminated organized resistance in the northeastern Rus lands within months. Novgorod, wealthy and powerful, seemed next. The Mongol army approached within 100 miles. Then, inexplicably to observers, they turned back. Theories abound. Spring thaw made campaigning difficult. Supply lines stretched thin. Or perhaps Subutai, ever calculating, chose to preserve Novgorod as a future tributary rather than destroy it. The city received a reprieve. The army withdrew to the steppes to rest and regroup. But this was merely intermission. In 1240, the campaign resumed. This time, Kiev itself, the mother of Russ's cities, faced assault. Kiev's walls had withstood nomadic raiders for centuries. They would not withstand the Mongols. The siege began in autumn 1240. Mongol engineers positioned siege engines around the city, stone-throwing machines, battering rams, techniques learned from Chinese and Persian campaigns. The bombardment was relentless. Kiev's defenses crumbled section by section. The city fell in December 1240. What followed entered legend and chronicle. The destruction was so complete that when a papal envoy passed through 6 years later, he found only scattered ruins and countless bones. Kiev's golden age ended in those winter days. The principality that had dominated Russ's lands for centuries lay broken. Southern and western Rus territories fell in succession. Galach, Volhynia. The Mongol army moved like a tide, overwhelming everything in its path. By early 1241, organized Rus resistance had effectively ceased. What had been a collection of squabbling principalities became Mongol tributaries. The efficiency was staggering. In roughly 3 years, the Mongols had conquered territories spanning hundreds of thousands of square miles. They destroyed major cities, eliminated princely armies, and established a tribute system that would endure for 2 centuries. The Golden Horde, as this western portion of the empire became known, now stretched from the Urals to the Carpathians. Subutai's strategic genius was evident throughout. He coordinated multiple army columns across vast distances, timing attacks to prevent enemy reinforcement, using terror as a weapon to encourage surrender, preserving some cities as administrative and economic centers while destroying others as examples. This wasn't mindless destruction, it was calculated conquest. The impact on Rus civilization was profound. Political structures shattered, trade networks disrupted, population centers destroyed. Chronicles from the period describe apocalyptic devastation. Yet the Mongols didn't settle these lands in large numbers. They established oversight systems, extracted tribute, but largely let local princes govern as vassals. This indirect rule became a pattern. The Mongols lacked sufficient numbers to directly administer all conquered territories. Instead, they created vassal relationships. Local rulers remained in place, paying tribute and providing military support when demanded. Mongol officials oversaw the system, ensuring compliance. The Rus invasion demonstrated Mongol capabilities at their peak: coordination, logistics, siege warfare, winter campaigning, psychological operations. They'd mastered every aspect of medieval warfare, and they'd done it while operating thousands of miles from their homeland in unfamiliar terrain and climate. But the campaign wasn't complete. Even as Rus's lands fell, Subutai's forces were already probing further west: Hungary, Poland. The Mongol onslaught was far from finished. Europe itself now faced invasion by the most formidable military machine the medieval world had ever seen. The Ruses had been the opening act. The main performance was yet to come. The Sword of God, Hulegu and the Destruction of the Assassins. In 1251, a new great Khan rose in Karakorum. Mongke, grandson of Genghis through Tolui's line, had secured the throne through a combination of political maneuvering and military backing. One of his first major decisions was to complete the subjugation of Persia and the Islamic heartlands. He chose his brother Hulegu to lead this campaign. Hulegu departed Mongolia in 1253 with a formidable force. Sources suggest roughly 100,000 warriors, though numbers varied as local contingents joined. His orders were explicit: establish Mongol control from the Oxus River to the borders of Egypt, submit all who would yield, destroy all who resisted. The first major target was neither a conventional kingdom nor a traditional army. It was a sect that had terrorized the Islamic world for over a century and a half. The Nizari Ismailis, known commonly as the Assassins. From their mountain fortresses scattered across Persia, they'd practiced political elimination for generations. The Assassins represented a unique challenge. They didn't field large armies or control vast territories. Instead, they occupied nearly impregnable fortresses in remote regions. Alamut, their headquarters, sat perched in the Alborz Mountains south of the Caspian Sea. For decades, armies had attempted to breach these strongholds and failed. But the Assassins had made strategic errors. They'd targeted Mongol officials and even attempted to eliminate Genghis Khan himself. The assassination attempt failed, but it sealed their fate. The Mongols didn't forget such affronts. Hulagu received clear instructions: eradicate the Nizari power completely. The campaign began in 1256. Hulagu's approach was methodical. He surrounded the assassins' territories with multiple army columns, cutting off escape routes and reinforcement. Then he moved systematically from fortress to fortress. Each stronghold received an ultimatum: surrender and live, resist and face complete destruction. Most fortresses chose resistance initially. They trusted in their fortifications, built on mountain peaks with limited access points. What they didn't anticipate was Mongol siege expertise. Engineers who'd mastered Chinese and Persian techniques now applied their knowledge to mountain warfare. Siege engines were hauled up narrow paths, supply lines maintained even in difficult terrain. The Mongols demonstrated patience that wore down defenders. Months-long sieges became routine. Fortress after fortress fell. The assassins' network began crumbling. Alamut itself held out longest. The fortress had never fallen to assault. Its grandmaster, Rukn al-Din Kersha, initially attempted negotiation. Hulagu was willing to talk, but his terms were non-negotiable. Complete submission, destruction of all fortifications, surrender of all assassin strongholds. By November 1256, Rukn al-Din recognized the inevitable. Alamut's supplies were running low. No relief was coming. The Mongol siege lines remained unbreakable. He surrendered. The fortress gates opened. Mongol forces entered the legendary stronghold that had defied armies for a century and a half. What followed was thorough. Hulagu ordered the destruction of Alamut's fortifications. Stone by stone, the fortress that had symbolized assassin power came down. The famous library containing countless manuscripts and documents was destroyed. Only astronomical and mathematical texts were preserved, as Hulagu valued scientific knowledge. Rukn al-Din was promised safe conduct. He was sent to Karakorum to meet Munka Khan. He never arrived. Mongol sources claim he and his party were eliminated en route. The last Grand Master of the Nizari Ismailis disappeared from history somewhere in the Mongol domains. Systematically, Hulagu's forces reduced the remaining assassin fortresses: Lamasar, Girdku, Maimun-Diz. Each fortress that had seemed impregnable fell to Mongol siegecraft and determination. By 1257, the assassin state had ceased to exist. Scattered survivors went underground, but their organized power was broken forever. The elimination of the assassins served multiple purposes. It removed a genuine security threat. Political elimination had been the sect's signature tactic, and the Mongols couldn't tolerate such unpredictable violence directed at their officials. It also demonstrated Mongol capabilities to other powers in the region. But perhaps more significantly, it opened the path to Baghdad. The assassins' territories lay between Mongol-controlled lands and the Abbasid Caliphate's heartland. With this obstacle removed, Hulagu could turn his attention to the most prestigious target in the Islamic world. The campaign against the assassins also showcased Mongol evolution. They'd begun as steppe cavalry. Now they commanded sophisticated siege operations in mountainous terrain. They coordinated logistics across vast distances. They applied systematic pressure that ground down even the most determined resistance. For the Islamic world, the assassins' destruction was both celebrated and feared. Many Muslims had suffered from their tactics over the generations. Political leaders breathed easier with the sect's power broken. Yet the ease with which Hulagu had accomplished what seemed impossible raised alarming questions. If the Mongols could destroy the assassins in their impregnable fortresses, what could withstand them? The answer to that question would become clear within 2 years, as Hulagu turned toward Baghdad. The sword of Mongol power had demonstrated its edge against one of the medieval world's most feared organizations. Now it would test itself against one of its most venerable institutions. The twilight of the Caliphate. The siege of Baghdad. In 1257, Hulagu Khan sent envoys to Baghdad. The message was standard Mongol diplomacy. Submit to Mongol authority and your city will be spared. Resist and face complete destruction. The recipient was al-Mustasim, 37th Abbasid Caliph, commander of the faithful, spiritual leader of Sunni Islam for over 500 years. The caliph's response revealed catastrophic miscalculation. He executed the Mongol envoys. Perhaps he believed Baghdad's walls would protect him. Perhaps he trusted in the city's spiritual significance. Perhaps he thought the Islamic world would rally to defend the caliphate. All these assumptions would prove false. Baghdad in 1258 was a shadow of its former glory. The city that had been the intellectual and commercial heart of the Islamic Golden Age had declined. Internal politics consumed energy. The military had weakened, yet it remained symbolically crucial. The Abbasid Caliphate, even diminished, represented the unity and heritage of Sunni Islam. Hulagu's army approached in January 1258. Various sources estimate his force at over 100,000 warriors, though exact numbers remain debated. The army included Mongol cavalry, Chinese siege engineers, and auxiliary forces from conquered territories. Even some Christian contingents from Armenia and Georgia joined, seeing the campaign as revenge for centuries of Muslim rule. The Mongols surrounded Baghdad systematically. Hulagu divided his forces to encircle the city from multiple directions. Supply lines were cut. The Tigris River was bridged to enable troop movement. Siege engines were positioned. The operation displayed the sophisticated logistics the Mongols had perfected over decades of conquest. The caliph's military response was inadequate. He commanded perhaps 20,000 troops, though their training and morale were questionable. An attempt to attack the Mongol siege lines ended in disaster. The sortie was repulsed with heavy losses. From that point, Baghdad's fate was sealed. Mongol siege warfare had evolved dramatically since the steppe days. Chinese engineers had taught them trebuchet construction and operation. Persian craftsmen had shared their knowledge of mining and sapping. The walls of Baghdad, formidable against earlier attackers, faced techniques refined through conquests across Asia. The bombardment began. Stone-throwing machines launched projectiles continuously. Sections of wall crumbled under relentless assault. Defenders tried to repair damage, but the Mongol fire was too intense. Within days, breaches appeared. Mongol forces prepared for assault. On February 10, 1258, Hulagu offered final terms: surrender now and receive clemency. The caliph's advisors were divided. Some urged submission. Others counseled continued resistance, believing Muslim armies would arrive to lift the siege. No such relief came. The Mamluk Sultanate in Egypt was preoccupied. Other Islamic powers were too distant or too weak. By February 13th, the city's fate was clear. The caliph agreed to surrender, hoping to negotiate favorable terms. He exited Baghdad with his family and officials. Hulagu received them, and initial discussions seemed promising. But Mongol plans were already set. What followed became one of the most controversial events of the 13th century. Mongol forces entered Baghdad. What happened next varies by source, but most accounts agree on widespread devastation. The Grand Library of Baghdad, housing countless manuscripts and texts from centuries of Islamic scholarship, was destroyed. Books were thrown into the Tigris in such numbers that the river reportedly ran black with ink. The death toll remains disputed among historians. Contemporary Islamic sources claimed hundreds of thousands perished. Modern scholars question these figures, suggesting they may be exaggerated, but all agree the carnage was extensive. The Mongols employed their standard policy. Those who had resisted paid the price. The caliph's fate entered legend. Mongol tradition forbade spilling royal blood on the ground, believing it would anger the heavens. So, al-Mustasim was reportedly rolled in carpets and trampled to death by horses. Whether this account is literal or symbolic, the result was clear. The Abbasid Caliphate, which had guided Sunni Islam since 750, ceased to exist. The symbolic impact was immense. For 5 centuries, the caliph had represented the unity and authority of Islam. Even when his political power had waned, his spiritual significance remained. Now that line was broken. Baghdad, once the jewel of the Islamic world, lay in ruins. The psychological shock reverberated across Muslim societies. From a Mongol perspective, the campaign was straightforward. Baghdad had defied submission. Its ruler had executed Mongol envoys, an unforgivable offense. The city's destruction served as an example. Other rulers watching would understand the consequences of resistance. This was the Mongol way: submit or be destroyed. No exceptions, regardless of religious or historical significance. Yet the fall of Baghdad also marked a turning point. The seemingly unstoppable Mongol advance had reached its western apex. Within 2 years at Ain Jalut, that advance would halt permanently. But in February 1258, as smoke rose from the ruins of Baghdad, such limits seemed unimaginable. The campaign's aftermath saw consolidation. Hulagu established the Ilkhanate, centered in Persia. He ruled from Tabriz, not Baghdad, which never fully recovered its former prominence. The destruction of the caliphate shifted the center of Islamic power. The Mamluk Sultanate in Cairo became the new guardian of Islam's heritage. For medieval historians, Baghdad's fall represented epochal change. A Persian chronicler wrote that the world had never seen such devastation. The cultural and intellectual losses were incalculable. Centuries of accumulated knowledge disappeared in weeks. The Islamic Golden Age, already fading, received its death blow. Modern scholarship provides nuance. The destruction wasn't total. Some neighborhoods survived. Some populations endured. Baghdad would eventually rebuild, though never to its former glory. The Mongol occupation of Persia and Iraq eventually saw their rulers convert to Islam, adopting the culture of the conquered. Yet the trauma of 1258 left permanent scars on Islamic historical memory. The siege of Baghdad demonstrated Mongol power at its zenith, sophisticated siege warfare, coordination of diverse forces, ruthless execution of strategic goals. No target was too significant, no city too sacred, no dynasty too ancient. The Mongols made no distinction between steppe opponents and sedentary empires. All faced the same choice: submit or perish. The Iron Jolt, the Pax Mongolica, and the Silk Road. The routes stretched across mountains and deserts, connecting lands that had once lived in isolation. For centuries, merchants had moved between them cautiously, crossing through territories ruled by competing powers. By the middle of the 13th century, something unprecedented had happened. One authority controlled nearly the entire pathway. The Mongols unified regions from the Danube to the Pacific, creating conditions that historians would later describe as a peace. Trade flourished under this stability. Caravans moved with confidence along pathways that had once been treacherous. The postal relay system, established by the Khans, improved communication across the vast domains, with messengers riding day and night between stations positioned every 20 to 40 miles. The transformation was remarkable. Cities participating in 13th century trade grew rapidly. Samarkand became a repository of learning. Markets in Karakorum and later Dadu drew merchants from lands as distant as the Mediterranean. The protection offered by Mongol authority meant that a single trader could journey from the Black Sea to the Yellow Sea without crossing hostile borders. Silk and spices moved westward from the east, while silver, fine cloth, and horses traveled eastward. But the exchange went beyond material goods. Technologies crossed the steppes. Gunpowder moved west, while Indian muslins, cottons, and precious stones found European markets. Ideas traveled too. Mathematical concepts, astronomical knowledge, medical texts. The world was shrinking. The Venetian merchant Marco Polo epitomized this new reality. His party traversed overland routes between the Middle East and domains under Yuan authority, protected by remarkable documentation from Kublai Khan himself. The tablet they carried guaranteed supplies, escorts, and safe passage. Without the order imposed across the steppes, such a journey would have been nearly impossible. Religious tolerance characterized much of this era. Peoples of different faiths coexisted under Mongol rule. Nestorian Christians, Muslims, Buddhists, and practitioners of traditional steppe beliefs lived side by side in cities throughout the domains. This pragmatism served the Khans well. They cared less about what their subjects believed than about maintaining order and collecting tribute. Maritime routes expanded alongside land pathways. Short coastal routes in southern domains developed into high seas passages reaching the Indian Ocean, Arabian Sea, Persian Gulf, and Red Sea. The connectivity was unprecedented. For the first time, people and technologies moved fluidly across the Eurasian landmass, yet this peace came at a cost. The very trade routes that brought prosperity would eventually carry something far more destructive. The efficient networks connecting east and west created perfect conduits for disease. The bubonic plague spread rapidly along these same trade routes in the mid-1300s, devastating populations across the domains. The systems that had unified the world would help break it apart. The legacy endures. The networks established under Mongol authority laid foundations for global exchange that would continue long after the empire fragmented. They demonstrated that vast regions could be connected through systematic organization and pragmatic governance. The world had become smaller, and it would never return to its previous isolation. The limits of empire, the Mamluks and the failed invasions. Every empire reaches boundaries it cannot cross. For the domains stretching from the Pacific to the Euphrates, those limits came in unexpected places. The year 1260 marked a turning point that would define the western extent of Mongol authority. The armies had swept through Baghdad 2 years earlier. The Abbasid capital fell in 1258 and the last caliph was executed. Damascus and Aleppo followed. The Mediterranean lay within reach. In 1259, forces under the Christian general Kitbuka moved into territories of the Levant. The path to Egypt seemed open. Then came an unexpected diplomatic exchange. Envoys arrived in Cairo demanding the submission of Sultan Qutuz. His response was to execute them. The heads were displayed on the gates of Cairo. War became inevitable. But circumstances had shifted. Mongol Khan passed away during the campaign against the Song. Hulegu withdrew eastward with most of his army to attend the succession assembly. Approximately 10,000 troops remained west of the Euphrates under Kitbuka's command. The force that had seemed unstoppable suddenly found itself outnumbered. The Mamluks moved north from Egypt. Near a spring called Ain Jalut on September 3rd, 1260, the two armies met. The battle unfolded with careful strategy. Baybars concealed the main forces in the hills, then used a smaller group to provoke the opposition into pursuit. Kitbuka fell for the feigned retreat and his army poured forward into an ambush. The Mamluks attacked from multiple directions, unleashing cavalry and arrows. The fighting was fierce. Kitbuka was either struck down in combat or captured and executed on the battlefield. For the first time since the Western campaigns began, Mongol forces retreated in decisive defeat. Unlike previous setbacks, they would never return to reclaim this territory. The implications rippled outward. The empire remained contained east of the Euphrates, leaving Egyptian domains secure under Mamluk authority. Syria would be contested, but the westward advance had stopped. The myth of invincibility cracked. Eastward, different challenges emerged. Kublai Khan set his sights on the Japanese archipelago after establishing authority over Goryeo. In 1274, a fleet of 500 to 900 vessels carrying 30,000 to 40,000 men attacked the islands. The forces landed at Hakata Bay, but a typhoon struck while ships lay at anchor, sinking about one-third of the fleet. An estimated 13,000 warriors drowned. 7 years later came a second attempt. The fleet numbered more than 4,400 ships bearing nearly 140,000 men, one of history's largest naval invasions. This time, the Japanese had prepared. 2-meter walls protected the shores. Unable to find suitable landing sites, the fleet remained at sea for months. On August 15th, as forces prepared to assault the defending samurai, a massive typhoon struck. At least half the warriors drowned, and only a few hundred vessels survived. Most survivors were hunted down on the beaches. The Japanese called these storms kamikaze, divine winds. Whether divine intervention or seasonal weather patterns, the result was clear. Some territories lay beyond reach. The campaigns in Southeast Asia faced similar obstacles. Dense jungles, unfamiliar terrain, and supply difficulties hindered operations. Naval warfare proved particularly challenging for forces whose strength had always been cavalry mobility on open ground. The empire had discovered its geographical limits. These defeats revealed fundamental constraints. The military machine that excelled on the steppes struggled when forced to adapt to naval operations or unfamiliar environments. The failed invasions demonstrated the empire's inability to successfully mount certain types of campaigns. Even the largest empire in history had boundaries it could not cross. The Great Khan in China, Kublai and the Yuan Dynasty. The grandson of the founder stood at a crossroads between two worlds. Born on the steppes, Kublai Khan would become something his grandfather never intended, a Chinese emperor. The transformation would reshape both the conqueror and the conquered. In 1264, Kublai moved the capital from Karakorum to Khanbalik, near the ruins of the former Jin dynasty seat. Construction began in 1266 on a grand city that would not be fully completed until 1293. The location signaled intent. This would be no temporary encampment. In 1271, Kublai formally claimed the mandate of heaven and proclaimed the dynasty Yuan, meaning origin of the universe. The following year, he named the city Dadu, the great capital, though it was known as Khanbalik in diplomatic correspondence. The Song dynasty still ruled the south, but Kublai positioned himself as the legitimate successor to ancient traditions. The city that emerged reflected both heritages. Chinese architect Liu Bingzhong designed the layout around Jade Island in Taiye Lake. The plan followed classical principles, yet Shangdu remained the summer capital, allowing the court to maintain connections to nomadic traditions. Kublai walked a delicate line, adopting Confucian rituals while retaining his identity as a Khan. By 1279, the final Song resistance collapsed. Kublai had achieved what his grandfather began, unified rule over all territories south of the Great Wall. But governing this vast sedentary population required different approaches than commanding cavalry across the steppes. The Yuan undertook extensive public works, including reconstruction of the Grand Canal connecting the capital to southern regions. Astronomer Guo Shouding reformed the calendar to achieve remarkable accuracy. Roads and waterways were reorganized. Granaries were built throughout the domains to guard against famine. The administration functioned through recognizable structures, even as Mongols and foreigners held many key positions. Religious policy remained pragmatic. Tibetan Buddhism became favored, with the Bureau of Buddhist and Tibetan Affairs established to supervise monks throughout the realm. Yet virtually every major religious tradition had presence in the capital. Muslims, Christians of various sects, practitioners of traditional beliefs. Tolerance served practical purposes. The court welcomed foreigners. Engineers from the Ilkhanate assisted in siege operations against southern cities. Muslim scholars contributed astronomical knowledge. Arabic numerals and geometric concepts entered scholarly circles. The capital became genuinely cosmopolitan, drawing merchants and travelers from across the known world. Yet, tensions simmered beneath the surface. An ethnic hierarchy placed Mongols at the top, with other groups ranked below. Many among the conquered population resented this ordering. The civil service examinations that had traditionally allowed talented individuals to rise through merit remained suspended. Traditional elites found their pathways to power blocked. Paper currency circulated throughout the domains under Kublai's monetary reforms. Trade flourished. The capital grew wealthy. Marco Polo's accounts would later describe the magnificence he witnessed. But the system depended on strong central authority and administrative efficiency. Kublai passed away in 1294. The period following his demise saw 8 emperors between 1308 and 1333, 2 of whom were removed violently. Without clear succession rules, violent conflicts erupted among potential rulers. Military leaders used troops to farm their own lands rather than maintain readiness, fragmenting authority. Natural disasters compounded these problems. Floods devastated agricultural regions. Famine spread. Peasant unrest grew, fueled by overtaxation, failed campaigns, and insecurity. The Red Turban Rebellion erupted in the 1350s, drawing support from populations who had never fully accepted foreign rule. By 1368, the last Yuan emperor fled northward as rebel forces approached the capital. The Ming Dynasty razed the palace complex and renamed the city Beiping. The experiment in ruling as both Khan and emperor had lasted less than a century. The descendants of steppe warriors had tried to govern the largest sedentary civilization in the world. In the end, the dynasty fell through expulsion, not absorption. Yet the impact endured. The Grand Canal system, the urban plan of what would become Beijing, connections forged between east and west, technologies and crops introduced across regions. Kublai's reign demonstrated both the possibilities and limits of conquest. Dominating territory was one challenge. Governing it successfully over generations proved far more difficult. The fracturing in legacy, how the world's largest empire came apart. Unity had always been fragile. The domains held together by personal loyalty and military might began fragmenting even before the founders' grandsons finished their conquests. By the time Kublai Khan passed away in 1294, the question was not whether the empire would split, but how the pieces would relate to each other. The death of Möngke Khan in 1259 during the siege at Diaoyu Castle triggered civil war among his brothers. Kublai and Arik Bök fought for supremacy. Hulagu remained loyal to Kublai in the southwest, but clashed with Berke in the northwest beginning in 1262. These conflicts, the Toluid Civil War, the Berke-Hulagu War, and the subsequent Kaidu-Kublai War, greatly weakened central authority. By the late 1200s, the empire had fractured into four autonomous Khanates: the Yuan Dynasty in the east, the Golden Horde in the northwest, the Chagatai Khanate in Central Asia, and the Ilkhanate in the southwest. In 1304, a treaty established the nominal supremacy of the Yuan over the western domains. But this was paper authority. Each Khanate pursued its own interests. The causes of fragmentation ran deep. The appanage system, granting territories to royal family members, created competing power centers. Each Khan developed local interests that diverged from those of distant cousins. The Ilkhanate remained more closely tied to the Yuan court, but even this relationship weakened over time. Geography played its role. Administering territories stretching from the Pacific to Eastern Europe exceeded any communication system's capacity. Messages took months to travel between Khanates. Regional elites reasserted power as Mongol rulers adopted local religions and administrative systems. The Ilkhanate's rulers converted to Islam after 1295. The Golden Horde followed. Even as they shared ancestry, the Khanates grew culturally distinct. Succession disputes plagued every branch. After Kublai's passing, many successors proved unable to match his capabilities. Disputes over who should inherit authority sparked violence. By the mid-14th century, two Khanates had completely fragmented. The Chagatai domain splintered into competing states. The Ilkhanate dissolved into rival powers. Then came the plague. The Black Death erupted around 1346, originating in steppe regions and spreading along trade and migration routes. It ravaged the fragmented Khanates, devastating populations and disrupting both military and civilian administration. The very networks that had brought prosperity now carried death. Millions perished. The efficient trade systems collapsed, economic foundations weakened. The tribute system that had enriched the Khanates depended on stable administration. As central authority fractured, local powers kept revenues for themselves. Trade suffered as routes became less secure. The prosperity that had marked the height of unity evaporated. In the Yuan domains, the Red Turban Rebellion erupted in 1351, drawing support from populations resentful of foreign rule and suffering from floods and famines. By 1368, rebels captured the capital, ending Mongol authority over territories south of the Great Wall. The Ming Dynasty restored indigenous rule. The Golden Horde proved most durable, maintaining power over the western steppes into the 1500s. But even there, authority gradually weakened. Competing factions emerged. Regional princes asserted independence. By the mid-14th century, internal conflicts and external pressures had significantly reduced its reach. Yet the legacy transcended political structures. The century of unified authority transformed how the world connected. Trade networks established during this era continued functioning long after the Khanates fragmented. Technologies and crops spread during this period took root permanently. Chinese innovations like gunpowder and printing moved westward, while medical knowledge and mathematical concepts traveled eastward. The administrative systems developed by the Khans influenced successor states. The census techniques, postal networks, and bureaucratic structures persisted. The Uyghur script adoption, medical exchanges, and numerical system transfers shaped subsequent civilizations. Ideas about governance and military organization spread across regions. The demographic impact endured for generations. Populations displaced during the conquests resettled across vast distances. Genetic and cultural mixing occurred on unprecedented scales. During the stable period, patterns of textile designs, agricultural products, and technological innovations spread from domain to domain. Perhaps most significantly, the era demonstrated that a single authority could unite the Eurasian landmass. The experiment lasted barely a century and a half, but it proved the concept possible. Future empires would study both the achievements and failures. The Timurid domains that emerged from Chagatai remnants consciously emulated earlier models. The Qing dynasty that eventually controlled territories comparable in scope drew lessons from Yuan experiences. The memory persisted in unexpected ways. The Mongol chronicles preserved stories of the unified empire long after political reality diverged. Successor states claimed legitimacy through connections to the original line. The idea of a vast domain stretching across Eurasia became part of regional identities. Modern scholars continue debating the empire's significance. Did the devastation of conquest outweigh the benefits of connected trade? How many lives were lost in the initial campaigns compared to those that prospered under subsequent stability? These questions remain contested. What seems clear is that the world after the empire differed fundamentally from the world before. The century of connection had broken down barriers between isolated regions. Technologies, ideas, and peoples had mixed in ways that could not be reversed. The modern global system traces lineages back to networks established during this era. The empire fragmented because no political structure that large could maintain unity indefinitely. Communication limits, succession disputes, cultural differences, disease, and economic strains all contributed. Yet the connections forged during its existence outlasted the political entity itself. In that sense, the empire never truly ended. It simply transformed into the interconnected world it helped create.